When I first was planning and then putting together the first episodes of this podcast in the fall of 2020, I don't think I knew quite what I wanted it to be. Yeah, I wanted it to be a little bit of everything that I enjoyed. Travel, history, nostalgia, fun topics about my own life growing up. But I think I wasn't sure how I wanted to present it. If I wanted it to be more serious, like a news broadcast, or more fun, foolish, free-flowing, many other F words I could think of. When going back and listening to the first handful of episodes, you can hear in my voice that I'm definitely not as comfortable. When comparing it to now, it's very cringy. So I started thinking, why not redo a few of those segments as we go forward on the podcast? It's a cheap, easy way to get more content. No, that's not why I'm doing it. It's like making greatest hits albums and then putting one new song on it to sucker people into spending $18.99 for a CD. What the hell? Not that I ever did that. I would just buy the CD single for $4.99. That'll show them. What we're doing here is we're going way back in the day, not only to episode 1 of the podcast, but back to looking at the rise of the Nintendo Entertainment System. Nintendo first made its big break in the United States in the mid-1980s, 85, 86, but video games had been around for decades before then. There was a game, Tennis for Two, that came out in 1958, developed by physicist William Higginbotham, and Space War in 1962, created by MIT students. It was the rise of Pong in 1972, and then Space Invaders in the arcade in 1978. Then that paved the way for Atari with its VCS video computer system, also known as the Atari 2600. This was the first video game console that I ever remember having and playing in the early 1980s, with my favorite game being Pitfall. But there was also Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Missile Command. The popularity of the Atari 2600 led to an oversaturation of the market with low-quality games, with the infamous E.T. game for the Atari 2600 being kind of the touch point for everyone when they talk about the video game crash of 1983. E.T. the game, for those that don't know, the rights, when bought by Atari, they had unrealistic expectations for the game and a quick turnaround. The developer had 5 weeks to make the game to get it out for the Christmas season of 1982. So the game stunk and almost tanked the whole video game industry. Nintendo, the company, started in 1889 in Kyoto, Japan. They originally produced handmade Hanafuda playing cards, which are kind of like regular playing cards, just a little bit smaller but thicker and more durable. Over the decades, Nintendo experimented with other business ventures like taxi service, manufacturing toys, but it was in the 70s that they started developing arcade games, with one of their first successes being Donkey Kong in 1981. Donkey Kong also introduced the world to Mario, which is he's probably one of the most famous video game characters ever, right up there with Pac-Man. The success of Donkey Kong and a few other arcade games gave Nintendo the confidence to consider building their own home video game console. On July 15th, 1983, Nintendo released the Famicom, which was short for Family Computer. This was their original video game console. It featured interchangeable cartridges and a more intuitive control system compared to previous video game consoles. The library of games that the Famicom had, including Donkey Kong, Mario Brothers, and Balloon Fight, really captivated the Japanese players. Nintendo would have brought their Famicom to the United States earlier, but then the video game crash of 1983 happened, and it left retailers and consumers wary of video games. If things had been an alternate timeline, video games would have been a passing fad of the 80s, with the Atari basically killing the business. A little bit of time passed, and then Nintendo rebranded the Famicom as the Nintendo Entertainment System, NES, for its US launch in October 1985. Part of their marketing was to brand it as an entertainment system and not video game console to kind of wash off the stigma that video games had. In October 1985, there was the launch of the NES in a limited test market in New York City. In episode 136 of the podcast, I did a segment about the original 17 Nintendo games that came out in this limited release, if you're curious what the first Nintendo games ever available in the US were. Early 1986 saw a nationwide rollout of the Nintendo, and by 1987 it was the best-selling game console in the country. This was the time when I got my first experience with Nintendo. I don't remember if we bought it or if we rented it, because back then you could rent video game consoles from the video store, which I think it cost enough to rent it anyway, and I thought you had to put down some kind of a deposit also on the console, so you'd get it back if you brought the console back unharmed, but if something happened to it, you owned it. I can remember renting the Nintendo and going to my Nana's house and my Nana playing Super Mario Brothers. I mean, she was in her early 60s at the time and was a child during the Great Depression, and here she was playing Super Mario and swinging the controller around, thinking that that would make him move, which is interesting because that's what you had to do with the Nintendo Wii with that controller. My Nana was ahead of her time. Nintendo's success came down to several things distinguishing it from earlier consoles, like the game quality and innovation. Sure, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Pitfall, they're all amazing games, but when you get to Super Mario Bros., Legend of Zelda, Metroid, Mega Man, these are all amazing, iconic, groundbreaking titles. Nintendo also introduced the concept of game saving. So imagine that. Until Nintendo, if you were playing other games, when you died in the game, that was it. You had to start at the beginning again. If I was a teenager when I had the Atari, I would have been smashing that thing with a hammer. Nintendo also differentiated itself from other consoles with their seal of quality. It was a mark placed on licensed games that had met Nintendo's quality standards. And once you build up a little bit of consumer confidence with games like Mario and Zelda, if you see that seal of quality, you're like, well, this must be good too. Nintendo also had a unique controller with the directional pad, the D-pad. That became a staple of console gaming. But they also had the ability to connect other peripheral things like the Zapper light gun used in Duck Hunt, and then the ROB, Robotic Operating Buddy, which I didn't know about as a kid but found out later on. Once the ball was rolling for Nintendo, then the marketing strategy with loads of TV commercials, magazine ads. They created their own magazine, Nintendo Power, tell you about games that were coming up, give you cheats to help you do better in games. There were also in-store demos. These were big, where you could go into somewhere like Toys R Us or Electronics Boutique or somewhere like that and actually try out games. Nintendo helped to rebuild consumer trust in the video game market. Like I said, Super Mario Brothers, Zelda, Metroid, Mega Man, Castlevania, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. These are all staples of my childhood. Each of these games I just mentioned, they were so much fun and innovative and different, and they all ended up becoming a series. I think Punch-Out had a sequel after Mike Tyson's likeness was removed from it. But there was a dark side to Nintendo. You couldn't escape Nintendo attitude. This was something in my house growing up that was coined by my stepfather. Basically, what it came down to was the anger that you felt when you were getting far in a game and something happened. Either you died or one of the siblings distracted you and you died, and you would then lash out at them. for no other reason than you lost at a video game. One of the most infamous things I remember in my house growing up, ways to screw with one of your siblings with the Nintendo, was because they had those gray cartridges, you would slide in and push down in the Nintendo and then shut the little hatch over it. A lot of you might remember this from the 80s, but if you stomped your foot super hard next to it, the game would pop up and just freeze the TV with whatever scene in the game was going on. The one that sticks out to me the most was when a friend, now former friend, this was probably 1988, was playing Nintendo in my house, and my brother distracted him and he died, and this friend took a swing at my brother who was like 4 years old. My stepfather went after him and basically kicked the bottom of the door in trying to get him. He ran out of the house and basically never came back. You imagine that? Going to a friend's house and taking a swing at their little brother because you died in a video game? Man, but I digress. The Nintendo, the original NES, sold more than 61 million units. And now it's at the point where you can get the little mini one that has all these games just in it, which is great for us kids that grew up in the 80s. But you also think about all the money you spent on games, or your parents spent, $30, $40, $50 for a game. And now for less than probably what you would have paid for the NES back in the mid-80s, you can get the mini Nintendo and 30 games. So Nintendo keeps on innovating. The NES laid the foundation for the modern video game industry. I've said it a million times on this podcast. I feel so lucky to have grown up when I did, where we had things like the NES, but it wasn't the overwhelming dominant presence like video games are today. They were like the appetizer to the rest of your life. But it was a very good appetizer, like the boneless buffalo wings to the rest of your meal that was life. I think I'm getting a little hungry, so it might be time for lunch and maybe trying to play a little Legend of Zelda.